Welcome back to Insights. I'm joined by ACC Professor of Political Science, Tim Kuhnlein. And Tim, we've been talking about foreign policy, we're talking about Secretary of State, we're talking about Russia, a lot of things. Let's move towards NATO. And this is something that Trump was against. So what exactly is NATO? And let's talk about that.
Well, NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's a mutual defense alliance that comes out of the Cold War. It was originally intended to essentially contain Russia, the Soviet Union, during the initial stages of the post-World War II deviation from our friendship. And NATO, the question is, now that the Soviet Union no longer exists, what's the purpose of NATO? And in the early 90s, with the collapse of the Berlin Wall in '89 and the collapse of the Soviet Union by 1992, people were asking, should we dismantle NATO? But clearly there are still threats. We had problems in the Balkans, which is what led to World War I, World War II. There was still the question of where would Russia go, and then of course the Middle East. And so NATO redefined itself as still a mutual defense alliance, but one more oriented on maintaining the stability of Europe. Russia is not part of NATO. It has a sort of a peace alliance with NATO, but there's still this sphere of influence. And NATO, of course, was the counterpoint to the Warsaw Pact, which has been dismantled with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So NATO represents this defining element against Russia historically. And I think that Trump's criticism of it probably has more to do with not only the challenge that it poses to Russia, but the financial burden that he claims, is such a. Are they carrying their fair share of the weight?
Right, because it costs money for a country to be involved with it.
Right, and we do carry a large proportion of it because our economy is so large. The dues for membership in NATO are defined by the size of your economy. And while it's about a $2.8 billion operation, plus any engagement that we do, so if we engage, like, for example, the liberation of Kuwait, as we did as a NATO operation embedded in the United Nations as well, we help contribute to the costs of the operation itself. But general operations about 2.8 billion. The United States contributes about 22% of the total. It's about $685 million. You compare that to the fact that our Defense Department alone is $700 billion. So there are about 9,000 staff comprising NATO. You compare that with our country, we have 1 million people in the Defense Department alone, nearly 1 million, and 2 million military personnel. Those are civil servants telling military personnel what to do and getting them their equipment, whatnot. It's a large portion of our budget. But we only contribute, well, I shouldn't say only, but we have 930 of the 9,000 staff of NATO, which is about 10%.
Right.
We finance.
And so, speaking of this kind of landscape, you wanted to mention about the Baltics, of moving of missiles to this area?
Well, this is the biggest issue, because if NATO gets compromised, then it does beg the question, is there anything keeping Russia contained in its what seems to be an increasing expansionist agenda? Of course, that begs the question, were we expansionist by claiming states that were part of the Soviet satellite sphere of influence during the Cold War, because you have countries in the Central European part that are now members of NATO, including the Baltics. The eye is on the Baltics right now: Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. This is important to us living in Northeast Michigan, because we have people from our base here who are training in Latvia in the event that Russia occupies Latvia or any of the Baltic countries, like Russia did the Ukraine. So again, it all is all very close to home. And just recently, there's been evidence that Russia has been moving newly developed nuclear Iskander missiles into Kaliningrad, which is a region in Europe. Let me see if I can find the map here. Between Poland and the Baltics. So Kaliningrad is right here. That's actually Russia, even though Russia proper is over here. But that was all sphere of influence that Russia had essentially claimed during the Cold War. And while it lost many of its satellite states, like the Baltic states, Belarus, the Ukraine, it has kept Kaliningrad. This goes back to the Prussian times as well. So, and they've got missiles there now, but you can imagine geopolitically how if NATO is weakened, this could embolden Russia to move its sphere of influence further west in the European continent.
So a huge fear is if NATO or something is abolished or even diminished, that Russia could have kind of freedom to move into other countries,
right,
like we saw them do with Ukraine earlier.
And that's really concerning for Central Europeans who were all sacrificed really in World War II after the Nazi occupation. Then they were basically turned over to the Soviets. I mean, we can't have it all, right? But we sure as heck fought for defending certain principles. And so this is the real concern now. Where will this go? And if this is all about big business, cozying up with Russians and gaining huge profits, what could we potentially lose?
Kind of this idea of, doing something for your corporation rather than
right.
actual interest for foreign policy.
Not that that can't be in national best interests, but who are the real winners and who are the real losers here? And we've built up these alliances through great turmoil and loss of life. You go to the other part of the world in China and we're experiencing something very similar. And that's why I think this Trump foreign policy is going to result in really a multipolar world, more multipolar in definition than we've seen since the collapse of the Cold War, where it was a bipolar world. We've been a unipolar world so far, but Russia has, although we have to be careful, Russia's economy is the size of Italy's. But still, it's like in the Cold War, it postures, and they have nuclear weapons. Italy doesn't. So there's a big difference. But China is doing something very similar, building fortresses in the South China Sea.
So what exactly are these fortresses?
They're basically man-made islands. There are dozens of them that are serving as air bases. So while they're not taking possession of land, they're building land to actually position themselves with little way stations, if you will, to engage and claim a greater sphere of influence militarily in that part of the world, which is something that China has not done. We have claimed that part of the world as our open door policy. We've also maintained a one China policy, and that's where the whole Taiwan issue comes in.
The phone call.
Yeah. And so, again, I think that what we're seeing come out of this Trump evolution is what will probably turn into three major powers agreeing that they're going to essentially allow for greater spheres of influence, will retract a little bit, but will stay engaged to the extent that we can strategically position ourselves economically with resources and perhaps coexist peacefully, but depending on how this game is played, depending on how the leverage is brokered, it could make key players really upset, and who knows how they would react. Of course, again, all of this is begging the question for Japan and South Korea, will we sacrifice them? I mean, Trump has made it very clear he wants them to carry more of their own burden for defense and to engage their own nuclear deterrence. Introducing yet more players in this highly dangerous world scene with nuclear weapons. He claims that they've been free riding for too long. So will they end up like the Baltics, especially if they can't use their resources to build up their own defenses? Will China overwhelm them? You can kind of imagine where this could go geopolitically.
It's definitely fascinating stuff. Tim, thank you for joining us this morning.
My pleasure.
That's all we have for Insights this week, but be sure to tune in next week, same time, same place for even more.
Insights into Northeast Michigan is produced by WBKB News. If you have any comments, suggestions, or topics you would like to see on a future show, please email WBKB News. This has been a production of Thunder Bay Broadcasting Corporation. All rights reserved.